Good morning, everyone. So, this is the last week of term, and these are going to be the last 3 lessons we'll have before Easter break. For today and tomorrow, we'll continue with lessons on how to answer exam questions, while for Friday, I'm going to post a small revision quiz to help me assess how much you guys have learned in the past months, and especially in the past weeks. Now, that said, I was once again impressed by the quality of some of your answers, even though the number of people who didn't submit at all is kind of worrying. It's important to keep trying and maintain a schedule, especially now that we are forced in our homes by the evil that shall not be named. This situation is going to change eventually, and when we're all back to normal, I don't want people to be left behind, okay? So please, for your own sake, do the work. Thank you. Now let's get back to history. Today we're going to try and answer another exam question, this time the dreaded account question, which is, I will admit, the most enigmatic of them all in the Elizabethan module, because the question itself often means everything and nothing. So, we'll try to make some clarity in the confusion and to come up with an answer to this exam question. Write an account of the importance of the Elizabethan settlement. 8 marks. As we did last time, we'll look at the following things. What type of question is this? What are the elements needed for a good answer? What you should write in your answer, and finally I will give you a model. Now, question type. The type of the question asks you to write everything important about the Elizabethan, about something that happened during the Elizabethan period. It could be poverty, could be Mary Queen of Scots, could be the Essex Rebellion, it could be anything, okay? And then use your knowledge to explain the causes and consequences of that thing. For this lesson, I picked the Elizabethan Settlement because it's a pretty important historical topic, which we've studied a few months ago, and because it's complex and interesting, at least for me, while at the same time being simple enough to write about once you get a couple of key concepts right. To do that, to get those key concepts right, you can use the notes to the Elizabethan module, part 2, which I have uploaded to this classwork, and the guidance contained in the GCSE revision guide, also uploaded in this classroom. Just open the notes and go to section 4 on the Elizabethan settlement. The content of the previous sections on Protestants and Catholic Reformations and the following ones on the threats from the Puritans and Catholics can also be useful, so check them out as well. Now, what's in a good answer? First of all, you need to write a complex narrative. You don't need to say something happened and something happened and something happened. The narrative needs to be complex and each of its parts needs to be linked. Something happened, therefore something else happened, but Z happened. So you don't need to do a grocery list, but connect the things. Show how they are connected. Okay? Then, since it's an AQA question, there's always the 2 or more things. If you give one fact and explain it very well, you still have a low grade. 2 or more is the key to get the high grade most of you deserve. Then there is the factual and contextual knowledge. I've been marking a lot of year 11 mocks lately, and most of the answers don't get past the middle level, the lower middle level, because they do not provide any specific example. You need to be as specific as you can, provide examples, provide dates, names, and details of when things happen, who was involved. Be as specific as possible, okay? And then you have to show second-order concepts. Again, if the idea of what is a second-order concept is not clear, look at the revision guide. There is a glossary in the first pages that will explain everything. In this particular case, chronology, the ability to put things in the right context. When did these things happen in Elizabeth's reign? Causation and consequence. Why did Elizabeth act in a certain way and what were the results? And significance. Why was something like this important? How did these actions change history? Moving on to the juiciest part, okay? What do you write in the answer? Now, First thing to do is obviously to read the question multiple times if possible. Write an account of what's important about the Elizabethan settlement. Then the second step is identifying, and maybe write down somewhere in the exam paper or in whatever paper you're using, the two or more things you will be talking about. In this case, we need to describe why the Elizabethan religious settlement was important and explain why. Okay, we need to describe two reasons. Let me amend the transcript and explain why each reason is important. Okay, this is a bit confusing, but it will be clearer in a few seconds. You will have to explain, describe two reasons why the Elizabethan religious settlement was important and explain why each of the reasons you decided is in itself important and significant. You will need 2 or more points, and as usual, I will give you 3. Now, first point, the Elizabethan settlement was important because it was a compromise between radical Protestants and Catholic rituals. 2. The settlement gave the country some form of religious stability after a time of deep religious conflicts. 3. It gave England a national church, which shaped its history and continues to do this to this day. Now, let's start with the first point, the compromise. The fact that the Elizabethan settlement was in fact a compromise. We can say that the settlement created a church that, as a modern historian put it, thinks Protestant but looks Catholic. In the exam, if you have a question about the Elizabethan settlement, use that quote because it's fantastic. I'm going to use it at least 3 more times during this video. Now, what did this mean, that it looks Protestant, but it thinks Protestant but looks Catholic? It means that several exterior elements of Catholicism were kept, because most people in the countrysides were still very attached to them. The peasants did not care about Protestantism. They wanted the flair and the habits and all the Catholic things, okay? So those elements were kept, because most of people, again, were very attached to them. But the actual religious beliefs and certain practices as well became Protestant. Here are 2 examples you can use in your answer. They are all taken from the notes. As for Catholicism, for the Catholic elements, the old hierarchy was maintained, and the system of bishops and archbishops that had existed for 1,000 years in England was not changed. The only major change was that now the head of the church, the boss of the clergy, was not the Pope in Rome, but the Queen in London. Second point, Edward VI, Elizabeth's half-brother, had forbidden the colourful vestments in the robes that the Catholic clergy had used in the ceremony. Elizabeth reinstated them and made priests use them, because that's what most people were used to, and she didn't want to change traditional religion too much. Otherwise, she would have upset most people in the countryside. However, there were also changes that made it think Protestant. The Bible was translated in English, and every church in the country needed to have a copy of it approved by the Queen. The Catholic Bible was in Latin, and translating it was an extremely Protestant thing. It was one of the main reasons why the Protestant reform happened in the first place. Then, another Protestant point is that priests were allowed to get married. Once again, the battle against the celibacy of the clergy was something extremely Protestant, one of Martin Luther's main battle. To sum up this point, we can say that the Elizabethan settlement was important because, as we said already, it made the Church of England look Catholic but think Protestant. It's just too good of a sentence to pass out, to avoid overusing in this context. Moving on to the second point, the settlement provided religious stability. Now, look in your notes at section 3, Protestants and Catholics. It will show you some example of how the country was divided in terms of religion. We can focus on 2 major events. The Pilgrimage of Grace, which took place in 1536, and which was a rebellion of Catholics in Yorkshire and right here in Lincolnshire, and the burnings made by Queen Mary before her death in 1558. I will not go into detail about it, but if you need more detail, everything is in the notes or on Wikipedia or around the internet. Now, while there will still be Catholics and Puritans creating disturbances in the next years, the level of religious turmoil in the country would never be the same again. Okay, the country became very much religiously unified after a period of incredible religious turmoil. The Elizabethan settlement ensured a remarkable level of stability, while other places in Europe, like France and Germany, were absolutely falling apart in wars of religion. Think of in France, the Saint Bartholomew's massacre. One day the Catholic militias in Paris agreed that they would enter the houses of every single Protestant in the city and kill them all. In Germany there were constant wars between the Holy Roman Emperor, who was Catholic, and the rebellious states, and all sorts of low intensity but very ferocious conflicts. Europe was falling apart for religious reasons at the time. England was not. England saw what could happen and said, okay, let's try and find a middle ground that sort of makes everyone happy and avoids people being killed for religious reasons. And it worked. Now, one of the reasons this happened, this increased instability happened, was because Elizabeth famously stated that she didn't want to make windows into man's soul. What did she mean? She meant that she didn't really care about what people actually believed in the privacy of their houses. The important thing was that they showed their allegiance to the Queen by following her church and by going to religious services. People who didn't want to change their religion were allowed to. They were called recusants and they needed to pay fines in order to remain Catholics. Now, while this might sound horrible and intolerant, being paid to practice a religion, for 16th century standards, it was really as tolerant as it could get. Trust me, I mean, again, people massacred, got massacred, expelled, killed, tortured, all for religious reasons across Europe. The 16th century was a weird time to be alive in Europe. Pretty much every century is, but the 16th century had its own particular flair. Paying a fine for not showing up in church was as tolerant and as mild as it could get at the time. So we can say, to sum it up, that the Elizabethan settlement was important because it brought stability and prevented religious wars such as those that were happening in France or Germany. The last point is that the Church of England, born out of the religious settlement, played a huge importance in shaping English identity. Now, every country, every nation has a set of markers that allow them to feel different from the surrounding people. In the 16th century, for example, they were mostly related to either language or religion or both. Mostly, though, it was religion. For example, in those days, someone was considered Polish not because they spoke Polish, but because they were Catholic, unlike the Russians, who were Orthodox, and the Germans, who were Protestants. Being of a certain religious denomination made you feel part of a different group, part of your own group, especially if you were surrounded by people who had different religions. The Elizabethan settlement was what gave England its own distinctive identity. We are English, and later British, because we follow the Church of England, the one true church, according to us, the English. The identification of Englishness with the Church of England, established by Elizabeth, would have huge consequences for the history of the country, because it determined who was English and who was not. And who was not a follower of the Church of England, maybe was a traitor, maybe was a spy, maybe was a French, worst of all. Now, one example of the consequences is the emergence of Parliament and the emergence of Parliament as a force during the Civil War, because Parliament was allegedly trying to preserve the Church of England as established by Elizabeth and as it had evolved in the 17th century against certain reforms made by King Charles I. So another example, the very complicated relationship Britain always had with Europe and the continent was also due to the fact that the English population always said we are something different because we have our own church, which we believe is the one true church. I hope that makes sense. Now, those were the facts. Now it's time to read the model answer. In the transcript, you will see that each part of the answer is highlighted in different colors. The point is in yellow, the evidence is in purple, the explanation in light blue, and the link is in green. So, let's read the model answer. The Elizabethan settlement was important for several reasons. It was a compromise between Protestantism and Catholicism, it provided some religious stability in a time of troubles, and it gave England a national religion with important consequences for English history. This was the introduction. The settlement made the Church of England look Catholic but think Protestant. Several elements of the Catholic rituals were maintained. For example, pre-Edwardian Catholic vestments were reinstated and the episcopal structure based on bishops and archbishops was maintained. However, several other things changed. The monarch became the head of the church and religious services were based on a translated version of the Bible. Furthermore, priests were allowed to marry. All these 3 points can be found in most Protestant denominations and show that on a theological level, the Church of England was fully Protestant. Therefore, such a compromise also gave religious stability to the country during a time of instability. In 1536, the peasants of the northeast launched a Catholic rebellion called the Pilgrimage of Grace, while the ferocious repression of Protestantism by Queen Mary cost the life of 300 Protestants who were burnt at the stake. Elizabeth famously said that she did not want to make windows into man's soul. This meant that she did not really care about the faith of the individual person, she only wanted to be obeyed. Therefore, the compromise she made to make everyone happy in some form allowed the country to enjoy a period of religious stability, as the Queen only enforced attendance to the church rather than private beliefs. In the long term, the Elizabethan settlement gave a final shape to the Church of England, a unique phenomenon in European history. Much of English identity and future history was shaped by the fact that the country saw itself as being part of the true Church, without being Catholic or totally Protestant. This had very important consequences in English history, such as the rise of Parliament during the English Civil War. Now, this is more or less all you need to know if you want to do some independent research. For this time I did not include any online resources. I would like you to see if you can do some independent research without copying. Again, stop copying. It doesn't make sense. You waste time researching stuff and then you learn nothing. If you wasted time to research stuff, at least make sure that it's useful for something. And that something should be your learning, so don't copy. Then again, sorry for the rant. Those should be all the information you need. So let me know if you have any question and see you next time.